I'm Aleta with Center for Inspired Teaching, and I am delighted to be here today with Jonathan Kozol, the author of many, many books that have shaped the work of those of us who are striving for positive change in education. And we're here tonight talking to Jonathan about his newest upcoming book, An End to Inequality. And Jonathan, thank you so much for speaking with me about your upcoming book. I want to start by asking you, in your book, you articulate with vivid detail the ways in which compliance-based schooling, which is especially prevalent in schools that serve Black and Brown students, harms students and their teachers. Can you offer an overview of the book, and what do you want readers to know? And most importantly,
Okay.
what do you want people to do after we read your book?
Okay. Well, before we get into the other issues, I'd like to make clear right from the start that my forthcoming book, An End to Inequality, is um, it's not as it's not as soft and gentle as some of my earlier books. It's it's a direct confrontation with the racist status quo in U.S. education, and especially at a time when segregation, racial segregation in the schools is at the highest level um, since I was a young teacher, um, and even worse, a disparate agenda, as I call it, what you might call a parallel curriculum, has evolved mostly over the past 25, 30 years, which treats the children of the Black and brown and poor as if they were a different species of humanity, um, uh, and treats them as if they're not able to learn unless they're under the constant fear of failure, um, and a punitive code of discipline. You know, a lot of our viewers are probably unaware of this, but a code of discipline that includes shaming rituals, um, like Shaniqua, you're in red zone, and you have to figure out what red zone means, but it means a bad area. It's sort of a warning code. Um, the the discipline that I've seen in inner city schools also includes lockdown rooms. That is putting a little kid who, may have made a minor misbehavior into a hallway closet for several hours, where he or she cries for their mother and wets their parents. Uh, and maybe worst of all, a frequent recourse to juvenile arrest, um, which is wildly disproportionate in racial terms. Black girls, for example, are 3.6 times as likely as white girls of their age to be hauled off from their school by police and put in at least temporary detention. In the book, I describe a little girl, 6 years old, in Florida. I think it was in Orlando, who had a little tantrum in her classroom, uh, and she was brought into the nurse's office or the principal's office, and somebody started reading a story to her, and it calmed her down. But by that time, they had already called the police, and the policeman came in, and even though she was calm by now, she started crying and said, "Please don't put me in handcuffs." Um, but he did, and he literally physically dragged her out of the school and pushed her into the back of his police car and took her off to detention. Now remember, she's 6 years old, where they they took a mugshot of her, fingerprint and mugshot, She was so little that they had to put her on a step stool in order to take the mugshot. That's the kind of atrocity that takes place all too frequently. So the first stage in the famous school to prison pipeline. Um, Corporal punishment is still allowed in nearly half the states, and it's most common in the states where lynching was most familiar. So that's one part of the story that I tell in the book, because um, I have so many liberal friends who think themselves progressive, but they're still talking simply about teaching methods, and they're kind of unaware of the just the wild cruelty, what I call the amputation of a child's dignity, which has become so common, but as not only, but especially in schools that serve Black children and Latino children. The book also focuses on severe funding cutbacks that we've suffered in the schools. And, typically what happens is there's a local economic crisis or a national crisis. And so temporarily they say we have to go on an emergency funding basis, and repair schools and so forth is postponed. But then of course, they assure the parents once the economy improves, we'll restore it all. They almost never do. So it goes on and on and on, and it leaves the buildings in ugly disrepair. I just think schools ought to be beautiful places. They ought to be like, I don't know, every day ought to be like a treasure of learning in a life affirming setting. And instead, these are ugly buildings, frequently lead infested. We've been warned for decades that lead poison causes irreversible cerebral damage, especially a young child. But that goes on and on and on. They always say we're going to fix it, but then there's another funding crisis of some sort. There's this pretense I call it the myth of scarcity, that there's this pretense that we're a third world country, that we can't afford to send in a team of people to get rid of the lead and put some cheerful pictures on the wall. And I just add another consequence of the funding shortage, which really amounts to an attack on the public sector, is the loss of school librarians and school libraries, which have been disappearing over the past 20, 30 years. Same with art and music teachers. And since No Child Left Behind and the miserable Common Core, I call it miserable because it famously discourages children from doing any writing that has to do with their feelings, their emotions. So it's almost as if the schools are in the service of the corporations, sort of training the kids to be predictable and obedient employees, in, I don't know, in a warehouse or factory or whatever. The other aspect of this is that this tough agenda has denied teachers in many schools almost all of their autonomy. So, a teacher who has a lovely creative style is sort of frozen out. They discourage that. But I tell the story of a teacher here, not far from I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Just a short distance to the north is a very poor industrial town called Lawrence, Massachusetts. The children are mostly almost all Black and Puerto Rican. And the, the state, has never considered integrating the kids in Lawrence with 3 or 4 very well-funded districts that immediately surround it. And they're close, and it's an area where there's not much traffic, so it would be easy to do. Towns like Andover, Massachusetts, where there also is a famous prep school, but instead of any possibility of integrating those kids, they brought in a private corporation of so-called teacher trainers. And this Lawrence teacher, her class was invaded by 3 of these teacher coaches who were sent in by private corporation, they're sent into the school in order to retrain the teachers to be more severe. And that they sat in the back row of her classroom, and one of them spoke to her while she was teaching. One of them spoke to her through an earpiece that she had to wear, and gave her instructions and said things like, "You look too happy." She wasn't to lift one leg higher than the other. She was instructed to stand in, quote, mountain pose. Now, I'm not very cool, so I don't know exactly what that refers to, but it doesn't sound much like Mr. Rogers to me. Some little boy spoke out of turn. She was told through her earpiece, give him a detention. So at that point, one of the little kids in the class, I think it was a boy, yeah, he stood up out of his chair, a little guy with an independent spirit, a nice irreverence. He said, "What's that thing in your ear, teacher?" And then another boy said, and the coaches kept talking to him, say, "Don't answer him," or something like that. And a little boy said, "Don't listen to them, miss. Be a person. Be you." I love it. He said, "Be you." He said, "I'm a person too." And I just loved that. I thought instead of a detention, that little boy ought to get a prize. I wish, that spirit, that healthy spirit of irreverence. I just wish that were an acceptable goal of public education, especially in a nation where we're faced with all kinds of dogmatic tyrannies right now. I just think almost more than anything, we don't just need well-skilled products from our schools. We also need morally irreverent citizens in the United States, not violent, not destructive, not cruel, but capable of challenging an evil that's right in front of their eyes. That you asked me once, why do I tend to focus on conservatives in my critique of the public system? And well, partly just because far right wing politically, people who are far right wing politically have been among the strongest voices perpetuating the dual system. But the truth is, I don't limit my focus to conservatives. I also focus on what I would call sort of timid semi-liberals, or neo-libs, as the media calls them, who have, they say the right things, but in reality, they've turned their backs totally on the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King and the promises of Brown, and and with some notable exceptions, of which I'm very proud. When there are exceptions, and I described one, a wonderful urban suburban integration program where the parents in the suburbs have been great, have actually um, transcended all the limits of a racist society and made these kids welcome and successful. But with that exception, an awful lot of liberals I know, like right in New York City, they get nervous when people talk about integrating their school on the Upper West Side, which is a mainly white and fairly wealthy area, with schools maybe just 5-10 blocks to the north in in the black in Harlem, in West Harlem. It's too easy to blame it on mad followers of Donald Trump. If that were the only problem, I would feel hopeful that we could lick it somehow, just go out and get more people like you to run for office. And but it's not just that. It's a system that's been frozen into place. And I don't think it's going to change if we have another couple of years of so-called conversations about race, which are almost self-congratulatory, too easy. I think we need militant action. That's it's my final book, given my age, and I won't live to see this, but I would love to see another wave of passionate civil disobedience on the part of kids staging walkouts from a truly destructive and brutal school, or teachers and children together. I don't think you can just write a letter to your Congress member. I think we need much more militant action. And, if I'm still alive, I'll go out in the streets and join it.
I want to ask you a little more about the self-described liberal education reformer folks. And I'm going to try to connect this question to the earpiece, because I know about the earpiece thing probably 10 or 15 years ago at Inspired Teaching. We had a funder who super progressive, caring about the issues that you and I care about. They were super excited about the earpiece. And as you know, at Inspired Teaching, a lot of the work we do is exchanging feedback, teachers giving feedback to students, students to teachers, coaches giving feedback to teachers. And this partner of ours said, you got to get these earpieces. We'll grant you, a bunch of earpieces. Isn't this great? And we said, well, tell us more. And the more we learned, we concluded, as you did, that, this is a horrible idea, right? But that idea of the earpiece is marketed still today using all the words you and I believe in: meaningful real-time feedback, right?
Yeah.
Respect for the teacher, respect for the child. It's place-based coaching. And it sounds great. So I think those guys, our colleagues who are lots of folks that you and I know who are out there focused on education and high quality teaching and equity, but in fact, they're boiling down teaching into these sterile chunks and teacher training moves and summer camp to prep you to become a teacher, and all of these things that are really perpetuating the problem in the name of equity, in the name of access, in the name of quality. And I would love your advice on how we engage with those guys and what we have to say to them.
First, I think we need to be very skeptical about these repeated cycles of quote reform. I've seen maybe 30 cycles of reform in the time since I became a teacher. In the 1960s, when I was teaching fourth grade in in one of Boston's classic segregated schools, which I described in my first book. Um, the There was a new reform. It was aimed at minority kids. It was called Operation Counterpoise, and it was like to count. It was stated that it was to counteract the liabilities of Black families, the cultural incapacity, their lack of culture. And the school board member even had the chutzpah to say, we don't need this in white neighborhoods because their families are fine. Anyway, that that came, and 10 years later it was gone forever. But by that time, there was a whole row of new reforms. There were schools of quality. Quality became a favorite word, as though education was, something like like a quality washing product or something, like a quality light bulb. And when that didn't work, the same group started a program um, called total quality education. And that was borrowed from, I think, some business theory. And then there were Renaissance schools. There were schools of excellence. I once came out of a school in the Bronx, which was, it had a name, but under the name it said School of Excellence. And there's a little boy that I really got to like named Obie, and he was with me because he was at the school. And I said, "What's that mean?" And he said, "Oh, that means we're excellent." And then he said, "And also good." I thought that was so funny. Um, I mean, it just showed that it meant nothing. Then there was the whole thing around NCLB, No Child Left Behind, and then the Common Core. And now I notice the Common Core has almost disappeared from only a few districts still take it seriously anymore. So it's like, I call it like a deception. It's like a way of lying to poor children or to their parents, as if to say, we didn't know it worked until just now. But here at this university, we just figured it out. Now we know what works. And I think there have been books even with titles like that. What works? As though, people were too dumb for the past 2,000 years to figure it out. But we just figured it out, and we turned it into 10 units of teaching, and we're sending it to your school, and you better teach it. We need a massive wave of skepticism about stuff like that. I think what matters is that the teacher has a reasonably small class size in a safe and cheerful setting, so that she has a sense of joy about getting up on Monday morning and going there. And it's going to be an adventure. She and the children are going to explore the world. They're going to explore their own possibilities. They're going to not just study history, but prepare to shape it themselves when they're 20 years older. And teaching and learning ought to be an adventure. And that's what I'd fight for. When I say things like that, people always say, I sound like an unregenerate version of my dear old friend Fred Rogers, that I haven't outgrown my fondness for him and his values. But I as I say in the book, if that's the accusation against me. I don't take it as an insult. I think that Mr. Rogers, if we're looking for models for teachers of young children, I'd opt for Fred Rogers before any of these tough guys um, with their penalties and paddles. Of course, I'm biased because I really loved him and had the joy of visiting schools with him and seeing him squeeze his bottom into those little tiny chairs in kindergarten, first grade. And I noticed he had a great gift for listening to children. He would listen. He would elicit unexpected things too. I don't know how he did it, but I tried to copy him as best I could. And we need our teachers to have a chance to do more listening.
Jonathan, will you speak more about that listening? I know that that is so very important, and it's a critical part of the work we do in teacher professional learning is literally teaching teachers how to listen, because I think we have this almost like this logic problem we're trapped in. We are all a product of the education system that taught us to think short term, that taught us to sit quietly until we're called on and say the right thing, and then be quiet again until the next time we're called on. And so we bring that, so many of us, into the classroom. And you're saying, don't use corporal punishment, don't use shame, don't use rote, meaningless, amputated versions of learning. And we say the same at Inspired Teaching. And so what we often hear back is like, okay, you're taking away all my tools. If I can't yell at the kids, and I can't hit the kids, and I can't put the kids in detention, and I can't call the police, and I can't do the worksheet that instead of reading the novel, what do I do? That's a question we often hear. And part of the answer is listening. I'd love to hear more from you on offering our teaching colleagues who want to make the change, offering them something to hold on to, some steps that they can take.
I think part of the problem starts with traditional teacher education. Now, I don't want to antagonize all my good friends in schools of education, because some of them are wonderful. And besides, they invite me to speak, so they must have good taste, I like to think. But the problem with teacher education, I've always felt this, it's far too mechanistic and limited too much to things like strategies of control, strategies of delivering vowel sounds or something. And it's not that I'm opposed to phonics, by the way. I don't want to make more enemies. And I used to teach phonics, actually. I have no problem with phonics as long as it's interwoven with wonderful books. The faculties in our schools of education need to elicit more from the would-be teachers by asking about what do they love, why do they want to be with children, do they have a sense of humor? Are they able to laugh and smile at something that's annoying but kind of screwy, of which there's a lot in the public system. And I also think the education given in many schools of education is it seems to lack a real exposure to the arts, to the liberal arts and humanities. Not much poetry. I think a future teacher of reading would benefit more from falling in love with poetry, taking a great poetry course in the main, not in the School of Ed, but in another department of the university, like an English department, and courses in philosophy and ethics. So they'd be more broadly educated in areas that kind of free the soul from constraint. That's what I believe. We're at a moment in history where everything is supposed to be science, and scientific. And one of the newest reform cults includes the word scientific learning. Yes, science is obviously important um, in the age, interplanetary travel, and without a rich immersion in the same treasures of our culture and other cultures that I mentioned before. Um, I don't think they will. I don't think they will be able to broaden their personalities and and sort of gain. It takes self-confidence. I think it takes a kind of cultural self-confidence to be able to shut up and listen to a child. One reason Fred Rogers was so good at that was that he was himself a beautifully educated person.
We as adults, and that includes teachers and parents, often feel if we're in the presence of children and we're not speaking, or one of my favorite words to critique, delivering something to our young people, we're not doing our and it takes great confidence as an adult to, I agree with you, to listen to a young person and also to say, wow, that's really interesting. I didn't know that. Tell me more. Because we tend to be
I like
taught,
that.
right? We're supposed to know I'm the teacher. I know everything. And it,
Education at its heart, especially with young children, I think we should do everything possible to indulge their curiosity and their unpredictable curiosities, even when they threaten to take us on a detour that wasn't predicted in our lesson plan, and not to be scared of saying, "Oh my God, how will I ever get back to that item 3 in my lesson plan for the day?" Just don't worry, do it tomorrow.
Jonathan, I think that's so true. And as you know, that in my work with teachers, it's based in improvisation, because the idea is an improvisational actor has a clear goal and welcomes all the crazy stuff that comes in and incorporates it. So you incorporate your kids' off the wall comments and questions and ideas, and you value those instead of batting them away. But that takes a
I
different
love that.
approach to teaching.
Everything you say strikes a familiar note with me. I've always hated the term delivery of skills. It's if we were working for FedEx or UPS, deliver. Okay, I'll deliver a consonant blend to that little girl. I think develop is maybe a better verb than deliver. I do think at the heart of many of our problems now, it's not just the corporate invasion of schools of education. By corporate invasion, I mean a lot of teachers tell me that when they were in ed school 3 years ago, whatever, they were taking a course that was they were taking a course that was based on a grant from some big corporation. But it had strings attached to it, like a lot of stuff about I don't know, some specific things about what expectations must be demanded of children at a particular age in the third month of their second grade or something like that. And so the corporations have been invading too much of life, too much of ordinary life in the United States, but especially in the public schools. But at heart, in the long run, wholly apart from the physical condition of a school, which I do believe is extremely important because um, I think just a dreary, ugly school with water leaks in the ceiling and so forth. I think that soils the mentalities of children. Um, it robs them of their sense of being little blessings to us. It's as though they were throwaways. Put them over there in that ugly building. My book really puts a lot of emphasis on returning dignity to teachers. And the goal of teacher education ought to be to encourage teachers to be as exciting and adaptable and always curious, um, and not tyrannical, and not feel bound to follow tyrannical instructions. And I think that means filling our school. I mean, ultimately trying to fill our public schools with wonderful human beings, but not just well-trained, dutiful technicians of mechanical proficiencies, but but people who can inflame excitement about learning to children. There's an old phrase, you probably heard it 100 times, which is often attributed. It's sometimes attributed to the Irish poet William Butler Yeats, but I actually think it originally came from the Roman classics, or Greek or Roman classics, and it was essentially this: education is not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire. And that's the ultimate. If there is a message, that's perhaps the ultimate message of my book.